Hey, everyone. There's a story that dropped Sunday in the Wall Street Journal that I think is a genuine bombshell, and we haven't talked about it yet. And I want to spend the first part of this video walking you through it because it confirms a lot of what we've been tracking here regarding the Iran war. And then in the second half of the video, I want to add something to what the Wall Street Journal says, something I don't think that the piece in the journal captures, but is actually, I think, the more important story right now. Okay, so let's start with the Wall Street Journal piece. I am not going to read it, the whole piece. I'm actually not really going to read from it because it's so long. You should read it yourself. It's very much worth reading. It's written by Benoit Faucon and Summer Saeed, published last night. I think I pronounced their names right. And the headline finding is this: while Washington was operating on the assumption that the MOU between the United States and Iran, signed on June 17th, was an off ramp to wind down the war. That's how Washington saw it. That the greatest kinetic escalation is behind us. Iran's hardliners were treating the whole 60-day window, because the MOU was for 60 days, or something else entirely. They were treating it as prep time. Here's the quote that matters most from the piece. It says, Iran's leadership, quote, came up with a different plan. In their view, the deal was, the MOU was, quote, likely just an attempt by the US and Israel to take pressure off the global economy and buy time for a bigger attack down the road. That's how they understood it. So instead of negotiating in good faith, they used these 60 days, the 2 months that just ended, to reorganize for a bigger fight. And then the journal lays out exactly what that reorganization looked like. And it's not vague. Khamenei, that's Mojtaba Khamenei now, the son, who took over after his father was killed on the opening day. Mojtaba installed a whole new security team last week. Mohsen Rezai, who ran the IRGC, he ran the Revolutionary Guard during the war with Iraq in the 1980s, now runs the Supreme National Security Council. We're going to hear from him in a minute. Hossein Taeb, the guy who led the deadly 2009 crackdown, he is like one of the butchers. He's one of the most feared people in Iran. I showed him in a video, I think yesterday. He's back running the Basij. I mentioned that appointment of him to run the Basij. And the Basij, remember what their job is. Their job is to suppress the people, to intimidate the people, to murder the people. When you talk about that slaughter in January, that's the Basij. And his job is now turning into what they're calling, quote, a popular intelligence network. Popular intelligence network. You know what that means? That means taking anyone that they suspect of turning on the regime or being a protester or being in communication with anyone outside Iran, a spy, and killing them or imprisoning them. That's going to be his job, the stormtroopers. Because now they know how badly Israeli intelligence penetrated them during the war, and they're terrified. They're terrified of infiltration in their people. Ali Abdullahi now controls both the regular army and the IRGC. Now, you probably never heard of him, but that doesn't matter. Let me explain why that matters. The IRGC is its own army, and then there's the regular army. There's actually like two armies in Iran, and like two air forces, two navies. There's the IRGC and the army. And the army has traditionally been kind of like, I wouldn't say moderate, but they're less part of the activities of the IRGC. And it was always assumed. In fact, Israel wasn't even decapitating their leadership very much during when they were knocking off all the leadership, both in the 12-day war and in Epic Fury, Roaring Lion. But the army, so having the army now more merged, more blended with the IRGC under one command, is also a kind of preparation for escalation, as it were. And Ahmad Vaidi, was also, this was another thing Mojtaba just did, was formally made the IRGC commander-in-chief, even though he's been acting kind of commander-in-chief for a while, but now that was made explicit, which is notable because he's a very serious hardliner. And he has an explicit mandate for, quote, powerful offensive operations against the enemy. Okay, so this is not like, they're not looking for an off-ramp from any war. They're not settling into a ceasefire. They're building a wartime command structure. And we don't need to take the Wall Street Journal's word for it or an anonymous Arab official as quoted in the piece. I actually have I have some video here of Rezai saying this himself on camera. This was shown on Israeli television, so it's going to have Hebrew subtitles, and I'll just say I'll voice over it in English. But he's talking to an Iranian audience, and a quote like this would have fit perfectly, but it wasn't in the Wall Street Journal piece. Here we go. We'll go to the offensive stage, and for total annihilation, we are going to go into an offensive period. We're leaving the defensive posture. This is what he's saying. In other words, we are stepping away from having a defensive posture. This was just the other day on Iranian TV. Now, again, whether he means it or not, we'll get to later in this video. But that's the rhetoric coming out here, right? We will enter a complete offensive and destructive phase, is what he said there. We might move into that same offensive phase. We're coming out of a defensive posture. Again, that's more or less the quote. And that's Mohsen Rezai. He was just installed as the secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. So what they're saying, at least out loud, that their strategy has changed. They're no more on defense. And look how that lines up with the language that is in the Wall Street Journal piece. Vaidi's own appointment decree, which is mentioned there, meaning when he's appointed and he's given his marching orders, it tasked him with, quote, powerful offensive operations against the enemy. Okay, so this is the Wall Street Journal piece quoting Vaidi's appointed task, and at the same time we have the interview with Rezai. So you see that they corroborate each other. They're moving into an offensive posture. That is what they're saying. That is what they're signaling. And the Wall Street Journal then documents the regional piece as well, that during this 60 days, during this ceasefire where America was trying to wind things down, they were sending advisors to Iraq, to their militias there, to Yemen, to the Houthis, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, during this whole MOU period, with target lists given to the Houthis, including Saudi ports and energy facilities, direct threats to Gulf states, that their energy infrastructure would be destroyed if the U.S. hits Iranian targets. They've been doing that, right? Iran has been issuing these threats now for the last few weeks, and they were, when America was striking them, hitting the Gulf states. And they even there was even an intercepted plan for a raid on a Kuwaiti island that they tried. And there's a quote in the Wall Street Journal piece from an IRGC spokesman, Hossein Mohebi, bragging about this to Iranian state media back in July. Quote, "We took full advantage of the ceasefire period. We enhanced our capabilities, accelerated our missile production rate, and improved missile accuracy," end quote. Right. So he said the quiet part out loud. And then there's the line from the piece that I think is the single most important sentence in the whole article. It quotes a Tehran-based analyst close to the regime, Mohammad Hassan Sangtarash, telling the Wall Street Journal, quote, "There is also a widespread view in Iran that the main war has not yet begun." Let that sink in. After everything, after the 12-day war, after all the strikes that we've seen, losing their supreme leader, the people running Iran's security apparatus believe that the real war is still ahead of them. Okay, so that's the Wall Street Journal piece. Excellent stuff. Try to find it and read it. It lines up with a lot of what I've laid out on this channel using Iranian state media directly. Recently, we've seen their escalation in language, which leads us to the second half of this video of what I want to share with you. This is what I want to add to what the Wall Street Journal reported here, because I think it changes how we read the Wall Street Journal piece and how we think about where we are in the war. So it's something that I've said before that I want to come back to and kind of develop. And I've said it in a few recent videos. So General Jack Keane has said, and others have also been saying for the last few days to a week, that there's an expectation that Iran is going to push toward kinetic escalation as we get closer to the midterms, right? Because they're going to want to make that spike in oil prices. They're going to want to make, they know the war is unpopular, and they're going to want to just pressure Trump to, drag him into an escalation, right? And a lot of people have been talking about that in the last few days. But here's the point I want to add, and I want to sharpen in this video. The escalation campaign has actually already begun. I've said this already a few times. It hasn't just begun kinetically yet. I'm sorry, it hasn't yet begun kinetically yet, meaning they're not really kinetically escalating, but it's begun rhetorically. The rhetorical escalation has a very specific target. It's aimed at American public opinion, specifically at making sure that Donald Trump walks into November looking like someone who started a war, achieved nothing, and is watching it drag on forever. That narrative in America. That's what they want. They want that to be the narrative in America, and it is in many circles. And they want to lean into that. Okay, making Trump look bad, making it look like a big failure, that nothing was accomplished. Hormuz Strait isn't open, right? It's dragging on. It's not getting anywhere. It's escalating. The price of oil is high. That's what they want. So look at what's coming out of Tehran in just the last 48 hours. Okay, I'm just going to show you a few pieces real quick. So first we have a piece from Tasnim. Hold on a sec. Here. We have a piece from Tasnim. Iran to vigorously pursue nuclear technology. Okay? Iran to vigorously pursue nuclear technology, says IRGC deputy chief. This is from today. Okay. Major General Mustafa Izadi, the deputy commander of the IRGC, addressing an event in commemoration of martyred leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. Major General Izadi said the enemy had entered the confrontation with scenarios aimed at overthrowing and fragmenting the Islamic Republic, but failed on all fronts, including in its attempt to gain access to Iran's nuclear industry. Quote, "We will continue the nuclear, scientific, and development path of the country with strength." So much for the claim that Iran's nuclear program is only for domestic purposes. This is an IRGC commander talking about how we're moving forward. What does he have to do with energy policy, right? Obviously, this is about the military nuclear program. And he's just saying, yeah, we're going to press forward. Okay? That's regime media. That Tasnim, this media outlet, is the outlet closest to the IRGC. And he also framed the enemy's whole objective as trying to weaken Iran, seize control of Hormuz, dismantle the armed forces, destroy the nuclear program. In other words, you hit us, and we build the bomb program back anyway out of spite, if nothing else, right? So we have that. And then 2 days before that, look at this. 2 days before that, we have this story. Armed forces of Iran vow unwavering fight until defeat of enemies. The General Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces vowed to continue confronting the U.S. and the Zionist regime until the complete defeat of the enemies and the realization of the Iranian people's rights. The whole point of this little piece, the whole point of this news item is saber rattling, right? Is just making a threat, right? This was a statement at an event marking the anniversary of Iranian POWs returning home from the Iran-Iraq war. So like a commemorative event, and he used it to say this. Now, this is not, they're not saying a military plan, and obviously, if they actually wanted to, start firing at America or, go to war, escalate the war, the element of surprise is pretty valuable. You don't generally say rah, rah, rah before you attack. So I'm not saying that they're revealing their military plans or even saying they have one. It's messaging, and the messaging is the whole point. This is what I want to get into. Here's the strategic logic of what Iran is doing as I see it. Iran cannot win this war militarily right now. Okay, they can't. They know that they can't. So the Wall Street Journal's reporting on the ground shows a battered economy, a degraded military, leadership under, that is under tremendous pressure, and a full-scale renewed war with the United States, the kind of scenario that people are saying, oh my gosh, is that what Iran is doing now? They want this full-scale war. Are they going to escalate when the war is going to become this full-scale war? Iran doesn't want that full-scale war. It's not in their interest to hand Trump a justification for finishing the job. And I'm not just speculating about that. There's a piece out analyzing this exact question. Is a new U.S.-Iran war actually coming? And they put it out on WANA. Here, look at this. Yesterday, is a new U.S.-Iran war on the horizon? And the entire piece is laying out. It walks through the constraints on the American side, like all the reasons why the United States won't attack, the diminishing returns from continued strikes as the easy high-value targets run out, right? In other words, what is America actually hitting at this point? Just like another bridge or another weapons depot? What are they getting for their strikes? That's one reason why they're saying America is not going to attack or is not going to escalate the war. Number two, Iran's improved air defenses, raising the odds of a politically damaging aircraft loss. Now, whether that's true or not, they're claiming that they've beefed up their air defenses, and maybe they have through the Chinese. Real strain on precision munition and interceptor stockpiles. They're capitalizing on on all the reporting in the United States about there being maybe not enough munitions. And the risk that any broader fight turns into a Hormuz-related rise in energy prices that no one in Washington wants. In other words, these are all constraints. In this piece, they lay out constraints on the Americans, reasons why the Americans have a disincentive to escalate. That's the whole point of this piece. Here, check this out. I'll read a little bit from it. Look what it says down here. Get all the way down near the end. Here. Right at the end. The more likely short-term scenario, therefore, is continued pressure, threats, and limited controlled military actions. While the possibility of a broader war remains, its potentially heavy costs serving as one of the strongest constraints on Washington. In other words, what they're saying here is that there's a disincentive for Trump to attack. So that's the entire point of this piece. All it's saying is why it's not in Trump's interest to escalate. So what is Iran doing here? They're talking about escalation and how, saber rattling and seem to be planning for a war. And meanwhile, they're saying Trump's not going to do it. Trump's not going to attack. Trump has a disincentive. So what's Iran's interest, if not a bigger war? What are they trying to do? So what their interest is they want to make sure that whatever this conflict looks like in 3 months from now, come midterm elections, that it is messy, that it's unresolved, that it's still a smoldering mess, as it would be perceived, right? It's unfinished business. We aren't anywhere, meaning are the Hormuz Straits any closer to being open now than they were on April 8th when the ceasefire went into effect? That the narrative that it's all a big unresolved mess with no end in sight, that gets pinned on Trump personally as his failure going into the election. That's the Iranian objective right now. And here's why they feel safe taunting Trump openly. Here, I'll show you a piece. They're taunting him. Look at this other piece. Trump's taco pattern, taco stands for Trump always chickens out. Trump's taco pattern is turning threats into bluffs. They published this today. The entire point of it is to taunt him. They're calculating, and here's why they're comfortable. They're calculating that Trump won't escalate this close to the midterms, that opening a bigger front right before an election will cost him more politically than absorbing another round of insults and threats, more than it costs them to do that. So it's worth it for them. They think they found the one window where Trump has to sit there and take their abuse, and it makes him look weaker, and which ends up giving more ammunition to the side in America that is messaging that this whole thing's a big failure. And that's why the rhetoric is getting louder instead of quieter. And here's the thing. It's working, at least partially. It's working in exactly the way they want. So take a look at this piece on the screen about Taco. Trump always chickens out. That he threatens deadlines and then he walks it back. Right? That's the narrative That's the narrative they're pushing. Oh, let's do this one. That's the narrative they're pushing right now, right? So, look, they quote a CNN analyst in the piece. Let's pull that up here. Aaron Blake, a CNN analyst, argues that Trump's history of backing down has made his recent threats toward Iran look increasingly like a bluff, a situation that he says could lead even countries such as Oman to assess those threats more cautiously. Blake also argues that Trump has adopted an approach toward Iran in which threats are issued without necessarily having the willingness or the readiness to carry them out. Let's jump to the end. From this perspective, the key question for Washington is not simply whether it can issue threats, but whether it's willing to bear the cost of carrying them out. Each time a threat ends without concrete action, the gap between the power to threaten and the credibility of the threat becomes wider. In other words, Trump's losing credibility from his threats. The repeated pattern also raises a broader question about U.S. strategy toward Iran. If Washington's objective is to change Tehran's behavior through maximum pressure, but military threats fail to produce the desired results, while diplomatic channels remain open, it's unclear where this policy is ultimately headed. In other words, what good is a threat if you're just going to keep the lines of communication open and not even make good on the threat? Critics argue that Trump is caught between two options. On the one hand, he does not want a confrontation with Iran to turn into a prolonged and costly war. On the other, he cannot achieve his objectives without maintaining military and political pressure. Under such circumstances, threats become a tool for bridging the gap between political objectives and practical capabilities. This is actually a very smart piece of analysis. They're saying, look, he has the ability to do these things he's threatening, but he has political objectives that make it such that he doesn't want to do them. So he's trying to bridge that gap by threatening. By threatening, he reminds the Iranians of his capabilities and says that he'll do it and hopes that can have the same effect, kind of almost maybe, as actually striking them, that you're threatening to do it, but it's not working because they're basically saying we're on to you, that you're not going to make good on the threat. Domestic political pressures, military costs, and the economic consequences of escalating tensions further complicate Washington's calculations. Like the other piece said, if disruptions to energy routes continue, higher fuel prices and pressure on global markets could extend the costs of U.S. decisions far beyond the battlefield. The credibility of any threat depends on the willingness and readiness to carry it out. If threats are repeated again and again, and each time end without achieving their main objective, their deterrent effect diminishes. Look, it's hard to argue with what this piece in regime media is saying. It's hard to argue with them. I don't want to become a voice for Iranian regime media, but I want you to pay attention to what they're messaging. What they're saying, on the one hand, they're talking escalatory language, and the Wall Street Journal piece lays out that they're actually preparing themselves for a much more serious conflict, for an escalation. But at the same time, they're like going na to Trump. They're taunting him. They're saying that he's deterred. They're saying that he's afraid to attack. They're saying that they don't take his threats seriously. They're taunting him, and therefore they're feeding the narrative that this is all one big failure. That's what they want to achieve. The goal of all of this is the narrative frame that Trump has failed in this war, that this war is a quagmire, it's dragging on, it's not accomplishing anything. And then when it escalates close to the midterms, that'll be like that's the next stage of this. That is what I am putting forward here. Okay? This is not a missile campaign. It's a narrative campaign. Again, make the war look endless, make Trump look weak and erratic, make the whole thing look like a mess he created and can't finish, and do all of that while very deliberately not crossing a line that would justify the kind of strike that actually does end the regime. Meaning they're playing a really gutsy game here. So when you read a piece like the Wall Street Journal report, and it's a very good piece, don't just read it as, oh, Iran's preparing to attack. If they were really, Iran, that's not all it is. It's also a shift towards a war footing that Iran is okay with us seeing. They're putting it out there themselves. This isn't just leaks and information they were hiding. That's why I showed you the quotes from like that interview with Rezai. They're putting this stuff out there. These headlines, they're escalating. So some of it is genuine military preparation, the command reshuffling, the missile production, that's all real. But a lot of it, especially the parts hitting the front pages of Tasnim and Wana, the Iranian state media, that's also theater aimed less at, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or whatever, and more, it's aimed at Washington, or more precisely, it's aimed at the American people. It's aimed at November. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share today. We'll keep watching this. Thanks for watching. And yeah, God bless.